Hi everyone, thank you so much for joining. I think we're gonna get started, and as people trickle in, they'll just start listening to the conversation. Okay. Okay, so thank you for coming and thank you for submitting such great questions. My name is Nomi Kolios. I'm the Customer Lifecycle Specialist at Freightos.com. As we all know, 2020 has been a very unpredictable year. So the goal of this roundtable is to have a discussion around peak season to give you a better understanding of how to prepare and what to expect for peak season. So just a few things to note before we get started. People often ask, are we going to be recording this roundtable or webinar? So yes, it's going to be recorded. There is no need to take notes. You can just sit back, relax, listen to the questions, and just enjoy. If you have other things to be doing while you're listening, feel free to do that, and we'll send out the recording in the next few days. Also, if you're somebody who indicated that you want to ask questions live, I just ask, please keep your mic muted for now and your camera off, and we'll message you in the chat and let you know when you can ask your question. We're first going to start by going through questions that people submitted beforehand that they don't want to ask live, and then we'll jump into your questions. And before we go into that, I just want to give you a quick word about Freightos.com. So as you might know, Freightos.com is a digital freight platform that connects small business importers with logistics providers from around the world. And our goal is to make the entire freight process simple. And what that means is that we have a platform for where you can compare different freight quotes in minutes, if not seconds, and actually book the entire shipment there and track it every step of the way. But we're here today with two of our freight experts, Judah Levine, our research lead at Freightos, who will be addressing questions about the freight industry and what's happening in the market and what to expect now during peak season. And Ellie Wolf, who works very closely with the logistics providers on Freightos.com and who can answer questions around booking and managing logistics during peak season. Just another note, we also have one of our freight experts who can respond to questions during the roundtable in chat. So if you have anything, feel free to submit it in the chat, and we're going to try our best to get to your questions, and we're going to try our best to get to all the questions that everybody submitted. So let's dive right in. Judah, you want to take it away?
Yep, thanks, Nomi. Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining. As Nomi said, I'm Judah. I'm the research lead here. I'm going to give us kind of an overview of what's gone on in the market. And then I'm going to hand it off to Ellie, who can really talk about the operational side and kind of more practical things. But I thought it would be helpful to kind of give a broad view at first. And the questions here, a lot of the questions that we received were very similar. So we tried to put them together and really cover the topics that seem to be on everyone's mind. So the first thing that we were asked about was, when does peak season start and end, and when's the best time to ship? So if we talk about a typical peak season, so peak season is normally from about August to October. And it's this surge in shipping activity due to a bunch of events happening all back to back. So you have back to school, followed by Halloween, Thanksgiving, and then into the holiday season. So all this seasonal stuff has to be shipped in addition to the regular volumes of normal inventories that also have to get over. And if we're talking about ocean, there's of course takes some time for the actual transit. So all this has to arrive in advance and on time, and that takes some planning, as all of this comes at once. So in normal circumstances, volumes start to pick up in July. August is often the busiest month, both in terms of volumes and also, or therefore in terms of rates. And then volumes are lower but stay elevated through September and October, and then usually by mid-November, activity tends to trail off. So normally shippers want to consider the cost benefit of ordering early. So we're already kind of into peak season, even for a typical year. Might want to consider ordering early before we reach that peak or peak season rates and volumes. And you'd have to consider that on a cost benefit analysis of paying lower shipping rates before we reach peak season versus having to carry those inventory costs and warehousing until you actually need the goods, versus paying the higher rates in the middle of peak season and accounting for maybe a little longer transit time but then getting them only a little bit before you actually need them. But in any case, even for a regular peak season, we'd already be at the peak as we're almost in September. And that's under normal circumstances. But of course, this year, as Nomi said, has been anything but normal. And if we look at our second question, please, Nomi. The other question we heard was, what has significantly changed this peak season compared to past years? Or how is this peak season proving to be different? So in terms of predictions, it's very hard to predict, both in terms of when ordering is going to be at its peak or reach its peak, and in terms of costs of when freight rates are going to be higher or start declining. And this is, of course, due to the pandemic. One of the biggest differences is in ocean rates, which at the moment is a reflection of that surging demand for ocean freight out of China. So right now we're seeing the highest volumes and the highest rates of the year so far. And both demand and rates seem to be going up. So in fact, US rates are extremely high, and they are at or near record highs for our own index, the Freightos Baltic Index. And they've been much higher than they've been in recent years, even during the lead up to when tariffs were rolled out during the trade war, which also put a lot of pressure on rates. So for reference, currently to ship a container from China to the US West Coast, or the carrier rate, rates have more than doubled to about $3,300 for a 40-foot container, more than doubled since the end of May, and are right now about 160% higher than they were at the same time last year. So rates are quite high. And if we look at Nomi, if we move to our next slide, this is a chart of freight rates from our FBX, the Freightos Baltic Index, which is an index of rates for 40-foot containers. So rates have been very high since June, as I said, and they seem to be continuing to climb. And the question is why? So I thought I'd give a little bit of background of how we got here. So if we go back to really March, April, and May, when imports to the U.S. from China were way down due to COVID having an impact in the U.S., consumer activity was way down, and imports coming to the U.S. from China are way down as well. And so the ocean carriers, in order to meet that low demand, had been removing capacity really at record levels by canceling what's called blanking sailings, canceling sailings. And they were doing that from March straight through until June, restricting that capacity to match the lower demand. And by doing that, they kept rate from collapsing. And if we look at really March through May, there was some increase, but really rates stayed level, and they were pretty much on par year to year. So even though there were low volumes, by restricting capacity, carriers kept rates pretty much level. But what happens if you look at June into July, this big spike in rates? And that's because in June, unexpectedly to most observers of the industry and certainly to ocean carriers, there was an increase in imports. From June into July, there was a 20% increase, July over June. July was the first year where there was the first month since the pandemic that volumes from Asia to the US were up year on year. So over the previous July, volumes were up. And this really came as a surprise to ocean carriers. And because of that, they had fewer ships in the water and fewer sailings. When there was less supply and all of a sudden a spike in demand, that sent rates going up. And since that started happening in June, the carriers have been trying to have restored capacity. So they've unblocked those canceled sailings. They've also just now started adding additional capacity, either as what's called extra loaders, which is kind of a temporary additional ship sailing. And some carriers are even adding new services. So it's kind of a set scheduled service on the Trans-Pacific in order to meet that demand. But even so, demand has been so strong that even with this capacity coming back, rates are continuing to go up. So in this kind of environment, it's very hard to predict what's going to happen, both in terms of demand and therefore in terms of rates, as we saw as what happened in June. So what's driving the surge? So there's a few things, and nothing is entirely definite. I mean, clearly there is still consumer demand for peak season, which some people were doubtful was going to happen kind of at all this year. So there's still back to school, there's still holidays, there are still consumers demand for those types, so those for goods for these time of year. It may be changing slightly the types of goods. So obviously retail and particularly fashion have been way down. types of goods that people are using at home for home improvements or sports or other types of work at home things have been way up. And PPE is also something that's still taking up a good chunk of space. Another theory is that people who normally would spend money on services and who have money to spend are now spending those things on goods that they wouldn't normally spend on, which may be two sides of the same coin. But in any event, a lot of you might have a better sense of what's going on from your customers and consumers than we do. There's the other possibility, or one additional possibility, is that we might be seeing, as consumers are active now, there might be some kind of urgency from importers to say, well, if consumers are buying now, I'm going to order now, while people are still buying. And this might not be kind of a typical peak season, but kind of an urgency to get things over while we can, which might come at the expense of volumes later in the year. But again, the pandemic has introduced so much uncertainty that it's very hard to say how demand will continue to behave. Will it continue through the normal peak season, strong through October? Will it go beyond because there's maybe pent up demand from when people were shut down? It's very hard to say and hard to predict, and you'll see different predictions from different sources. Nomi, if we go to the next slide. So the other question we heard, or types of topic we heard asked, was how long do we anticipate rates to remain high? And that, again, is hard to say. But I can say two things. So one is for the short term. As I said, ocean carriers haven't announced any cancellations, or very, very few in September, October, and they're even adding either temporary or scheduled capacity, which indicates that they expect September and probably October to continue to be strong, to be peak seasons. In addition, there are rumors that on September 1st, there'll be an additional or another GRI, general rate increase, which again would reflect the carrier stance that demand is very high and the market can bear additional increase in rates. The other thing that I would say is, as we saw from March until May, there was kind of this mismatch in June, that even when demand is actually quite low, carriers have demonstrated they're able to work kind of in an orchestrated way and manage capacity to keep rates level. So there's been a lot of consolidation in the industry since 2008, the forming of alliances to help them kind of coordinate better. And this has really been the first test case where we saw carriers really manage capacity in kind of an orchestrated way and having the desired impact, as we said, at least for those up until June. So even if demand were to really nosedive, I think at this point it would be surprising to see rates significantly fall, as carriers have shown they have the tools to manage capacity and manage their own costs. So I can't say whether $3,300 per 40 foot is the new normal. I'd be surprised if it stayed that high, but who knows? But I would expect that we won't see very, very low or collapsing rates, at least in the short term. Okay, Nomi, next slide, please. The other question we heard was about transit time. So what should we expect for transit times during peak season? So in normal circumstances, in terms of time in the water, if we're going from Asia or China to the US West Coast, it usually takes about 2 to 3 weeks, maybe 4+ weeks if you're going to the East Coast. And then a total of 3 to 6 weeks door to door if you were West Coast, and a little bit more if you're going to the East Coast. But when volumes are very high, or when demand is a little bit outstripping the supply of ships, there can be rollovers or rolled shipments. That means containers that don't make it onto the boat because there's just not enough space. And that will add about 1.5 weeks to the transit time. And that's what we're seeing happening now. And that's very typical for peak season. So it's a function of, again, the supply and demand. The door-to-door would normally take a certain amount of time. You have to factor in about 1.5 weeks additionally. The only thing I would say about that's unusual this year, and as I said, there's some sense of urgency among shippers that we're seeing to get their imports as quickly as possible. And so we've also seen that expressed as more demand and then more pressure on rates to the US West Coast from Asia than to the US East Coast. So shipping to the West Coast is shorter and usually less expensive. And so people seem to be preferring that route to get things as soon as possible. The effect that it's had is that normally there's about a $1,200 difference between East Coast and West Coast. It's more expensive to take the longer route to the East Coast. It's usually about 40% more expensive. But what we've seen because of this push towards the West Coast, because of the interest of speed, is that those rates have come closer together. So they're both way up, but they've gotten within about $400 per 40-foot container, or about 12% as opposed to 40%. So if you're a shipper that the speed is not really a factor, and you have orders that you could order now, and you only need them a little bit later on, it might be cost effective to ship to the East Coast when normally you wouldn't consider that. After all, if the final destination is closer to the East Coast. So that's a little bit something a little bit different for this year. With that, I'm going to hand it over to Ellie. I think the rest of the questions are really more up his alley and on the operational side.
Thanks very much, Judah. That was really interesting. All right, so that was great to have that high-level look at what's going on with pricing and timing. I've also been discussing these same issues a lot with a lot of the vendors that you see on Freightos.com who are offering their quotes, and discussing with them lately what's going to be affected that they can advise clients directly. So we'll begin with how far out should we book our shipment? Does booking early make a difference on cost or just time? Booking early, especially when we talk about ocean container shipping, doesn't necessarily reduce any costs in general, because the gate-in date will always determine the actual price for shipping. Those of you who have shipped containers know that the carriers will apply GRIs as late as up till the shipment is gated in. What is perhaps advisable, especially in light of peak season that we've started getting into, and we know that prices are most likely just going to increase through October, starting now. Shipping early, if you can possibly swing that, would be pretty effective now. That might save you some costs as opposed to waiting another month and having your shipment sail then. Okay, Nomi, can we go to the next one? Thanks. All right, the best way to mitigate pricing increases and delays in storage fees. So the advice I'll have right now applies to shipping any time of the year. And peak season, shipping's already kind of a crazy business, even in the calmest of times. And in peak season, it just means that everything is at a higher level of chaos. So in order to mitigate these extra fees, the best thing that you can do is be as prepared as possible on your end. You want to make sure that you're on top of all your documentation requirements well before the shipment is ready to be picked up or consigned to your forwarder. Make sure that there are no possible discrepancies on your customs paperwork that could come back and cause these errors later. Because what happens in general in shipping is that these sorts of errors are often responsible for why, not always, but often why customs delays and other delays happen. And during peak season, the shipping lines, the custom brokers, and the freight forwarders are all working at maximum capacity. So things usually go right, things can go wrong, but during peak season, things that go wrong will tend to go more wrong. Delays will be longer, cost may be higher. Okay. So how can you clear customs and FDA faster? Is customs targeting China shipments with more than normal scrutiny? So the first part about clearing faster is also related to what I said before about preparing your paperwork early. Um, at Freightos, we work with customs brokers directly as well as freight forwarders who provide the service on their own. And one issue that we've seen come up is where the full paperwork isn't provided by the buyer, including their identification documents, importer of record, and their POA for customs clearance. Any delays in that cause serious problems with customs clearance later on, or can. And we recommend that you stay on top of your shipments and ensure that the CBP, the customs broker, is provided with all necessary information before your shipment sails. Really, your freight forwarder should be on top of this as well as your customs broker, but this is how you can mitigate additional issues with your shipment by just having that in mind. You want the paperwork done before sailing. Is customs targeting China shipments with more than normal scrutiny? Normally, they target China shipments with more scrutiny. I don't think that there's any increase due to the season. Maybe later on we'll have more questions about that. Okay, what precautions should be taken before booking a shipment? It's an interesting question, and it can be affected by peak season or Corona. If I could bring up something that we saw from the beginning of when rules were being relaxed around Corona, right around the end of May, we saw that a lot of shipments incurred issues where the destination receiving warehouse had no manpower. So that was causing a lot of shipments to get stalled at the destination. Similarly, in peak season, you just want to make sure that everything's lined up. Before you book a shipment during peak season or the rest of the year, you want to make sure that your supplier is fully aligned with what you need as far as getting your goods ready for shipping and produced on time. Also, you need to make sure that all terms and payments are settled with the supplier in time for the forwarder to move them. And what are the advantages, disadvantages of diversifying containers? Honestly, I think that if someone has to find out the best answer for their customs clearance concerns, they really should refer directly to their customs broker, since that's a very specialized field and we don't have direct advice on that. I can say that with diversified containers, there are often more HS codes for the Customs Bureau to examine, but unfortunately I don't have too much more than that. All right. So for buyers who usually ship to Amazon warehouses, with the new restrictions on quantities, Amazon has been having buyers ship to third-party warehouses. And if a buyer is thinking about splitting their shipment up, it can often be a cheaper shipment to just have the entire consignment go to the third-party warehouse and have one of Amazon's delivery partners arrange the final mile from there, which has been an option, and then all your goods are in one place to complete fulfillment. So I'm glad I had the chance to go over those questions. They were pretty interesting. Over to you, Nomi.
Thank you guys. That was really, really informative and really, really interesting. I'm just going to open it up for a few minutes and see if anybody wants to submit a question in the chat that we can go through live right now. So if anybody's interested, you know, go ahead and submit something. And if not, then this has been really, really helpful, and we're going to send out a recording, but we're just going to wait another minute or so to see if anybody has any live questions. Okay. Okay, great. We have some questions coming in. So can you remind us again, what is the peak season time frame? I know what it normally is, but perhaps can you talk again about what it is for this year? Judah, maybe you can address that.
I'm sorry, what was the question?
No problem.
Really
Can you just remind us again, what is the peak season time frame?
Right. So generally, peak season starts heating up around July and peaks around uh, August, and then will stay elevated through the start of November. Again, the challenge this year is we're certainly seeing a surge and things are very active, but it's very difficult to predict. Are we at the peak? Will September actually decline? Or will things stay elevated, continue to climb, or stay elevated through a normal peak through October, beginning of November, or will things start to trail off? So it's very, very hard to say. Again, I said for the short term, it looks like September and October will continue to be strong, will continue to be peak. Just in terms of taking what the ocean carriers are doing, how they're planning their capacity. They're adding additional capacity beyond what was even already planned. So in terms of their predictions, they think that September, October will continue to be.
Okay, great, thank you. And this Ellie might be more for you than Judah. Do they scrutinize Taiwan the same way that they scrutinize China? Are you seeing the same type of strictness with other countries other than China?
Well, there's no official strictness. It's not like there are any countries that have a reason to scrutinize more. There are different guidelines from different countries. For China, for example, there are regulations that made in China stickers have to be applied to certain goods. So I think the rules are more lax from Taiwan for shipments coming from Taiwan than for China. But again, that's more of a customs broker question.
And how much lead time do you need to reserve space on a ship?
So you should be able to book shipments. Reserving space, we don't currently have guaranteed space on the marketplace. Your freight forwarder may be able to provide it for an additional charge after booking. But in many cases, in peak season, you can as regularly book 2 weeks, 4 weeks in advance, like most times, and there just is the possibility of 1 to 2 weeks rollover added onto that. That's the danger of the peak season.
Great, thank you. And what about, can you speak about typical cost via air versus sea? Maybe Judah, that might be more for you.
So air is as a rule is more expensive, even as ocean has been quite expensive. Air is usually the more expensive option, and and you're paying for speed in that case. Air rates, if we're talking coming out of Asia, were extremely high for air cargo during the outset of the pandemic, or really until May. They were extremely high and very hard to get space because of those rates. Rates have come down significantly since then, but they are still elevated compared to normal air cargo rates. In air cargo, really the issue has been capacity. So if we talk about in ocean, the issue was demand. At least in those early months in March, April, May. In air cargo, it was really about capacity. So a lot of air cargo travels by passenger jet in the in the lower deck where everything besides people goes. And because there was so little passenger travel, there's been much less capacity, and that's still the case. So that is still a factor keeping air cargo elevated. But again, it's come down to from what it was. Earlier on, there was this peak demand of PPE that was really pushing air cargo rates through the roof. At the moment, again, those have come down from those extremely high rates, but still elevated just of this lack of capacity from passenger travel.
And can you speak about fulfillment companies, have they been affected like ShipBob or FBA? Is that something that one of you can perhaps speak to?
I can say that because of Corona as well, they've been affected. They have their own regulations which affect how goods are received by their warehouse. And that means, for example, they will not transfer paperwork between between truckers and their warehouse workers. And they will also be receiving peak season levels of shipments. So I'm sure that the service levels from those fulfillment companies will be just as strained as everywhere else during the peak season.
Okay, and what about medical versus non-medical? So I think if I'm understanding the question correctly, PPE and not versus not PPE. What are you seeing these days?
Is this specifically about peak season or in general?
Let's focus on peak season, I think.
I don't think that peak season has a real effect on PPE. But PPE is very relevant these days, just as part of Corona.
Okay, great. Thank you. Are there any other questions that anybody wants to ask before we wrap up? Oh, okay. Another question. How do you choose a vendor? How do you, what's the best way to select a vendor? And I believe that's speaking about the logistics provider. How would you choose who to work with?
Well, Freightos will not recommend any specific vendors of ours. We work with the vendors that we like to work with. We regularly monitor them and make sure that they keep up their quality. And we are developing different ways of presenting their ongoing performance on the marketplace. But in the meantime, the major tool that we have are customer reviews from yourselves. So if you check out other customer reviews, especially if you actually read through them, you might identify that some people that are giving a low score on a review don't really understand shipping based on their score. Some people who leave a comment that can really identify what a forwarder does right or wrong. And based on your own experiences, you can see that that might be a forwarder that is helpful for you or less helpful. There are differences on our platform on where forwarders are located. So if you have difficult times communicating off hours, that might affect your choice. Typically, if you have a forwarder located at the origin, they'll be stronger on the origin service, where if they're located at the destination country, they'll be stronger there, both in terms of pricing and service.
And we have another kind of similar question. So how do you advise people on Freightos.com to choose a customs broker? Is it that we recommend, or when they use our service, do we recommend, or how do they go about selecting who to use?
So when you search for and book a shipment on Freightos.com, you can choose if customs clearance will be included or not. When you include the option, each freight forwarder that you can choose from has a specific customs broker or several that they work with. In most cases, you'll be working with whoever the freight forwarder picks as their customs broker if you select the service, and they'll be responsible for aligning with you and making sure everything goes smoothly. In some cases, you may see that some freight forwarders are working with third-party FedEx customs brokerage. And it just depends on the forwarder if they offer that service or not. And the difference there is that you just know which company right away is doing the clearance.
Okay, great. Are there any other final questions before we wrap up? Okay, amazing. So first of all, I want to thank Judah and Ellie. This was really, really great. This was really informative. really appreciate your time and going through all of these questions. Thank you everyone for joining and for submitting these questions. We wouldn't have had this without your questions, so thank you. And I just want to remind everyone we have a Facebook group called Freightos.com Insiders, where you can connect with other importers, ask questions. So really recommend joining that, and we'll send you all a recording in the next few days. So thank you again for joining, and smooth shipping and smooth peak season. Take care.